Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Ashley. Welcome, Ashley, to the video. We're going to start out with question number 1. So, what was different in the type of information needed to complete each analysis between social justice framework and choice policy analysis? Charlotte, we're going to you first.
Okay. Well, one of the biggest differences that stood out to me was the sort of cost-benefit analysis component, and that in the choice policy that was really based in the financial components and those sort of costs, whereas in the social justice policy it was much more oriented to the sort of cost-benefit of the lived experience of the individuals that the policy is aimed for.
I think another thing that stood out to me is that, you could basically write a pretty thorough choice analysis while just looking at the legislative text or policy text of a policy. You wouldn't really need to know anything about the authorship process or even really the net effects of on the population. You need to know the rules that were going to govern those effects, but you don't really need to know what is actually happening to people in terms of that sort of lived experience. So that's what really stood out to me and what caused me to have pretty different conclusions of a similar parts of the policy through the different frameworks.
Right. I think I agree with what both of you have said. I think that choice policy analysis to me really feels like the beginning of looking at and evaluating different policies, and to me looks at almost more, in my brain, like quantitative type information, so logistics, like Sam said, like letter of the law type stuff. And then you can kind of begin to formulate your own opinions and look at impacts of different populations. And then the social justice framework really takes that like a step further, in my experience.
I think another, I guess this is a little past what the question was getting at, but one thing that stands out to me is it feels like I got a much more sort of three-dimensional, what felt like holistic analysis out of the social justice framework. But I think the choice analysis is also pretty helpful in terms of thinking about sort of like political feasibility of something in terms of how it's going to be funded, what the sort of political process behind that is going to be, like how the appropriations would happen, what different stakeholders might, you need to sort of identify who you're asking to pay for the cost of a given policy. So I think it is useful in that way, but it felt much more sort of limited and two-dimensional and much less attuned to the like on-the-ground effects.
And I think ideally, if you're trying to sort of frame the argument in a certain way or make a case for, they're best used in tandem because they sort of hit at different components that, depending on who your audience is or who you're trying to compel, that this legislation is important, then you can sort of pick and choose those different components to sort of fit the person that you're speaking with about it.
Yeah, I agree, like with the tandem comment, because we can spend a ton of time doing budgets and looking at like whether or not financially we can make it happen, what the laws actually say, but in the end, if it's not positively impacting the population that is the target of the policy, or it's not even fair to everybody, or the equity is totally skewed to one population versus the other, then what are we doing all of this for? Like, why even go through the whole thing?
Yeah, and if you're only looking at one through the lens of one framework, then you're inevitably missing some piece of information.
Yeah.
So you sort of need both.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think another really critical element of the social justice policy or the framework for me is just that authorship piece and looking at representation in terms of policy development and who is allowed to be part of creating it. Because you see a lot of really well-intended, and I think like in my Hearth Act analysis, even like really well-intended legislation that isn't developed very well, or isn't very inclusive in terms of its development, is pretty limited in terms of the impact. And and sometimes I think gets framed in ways that have increasingly negative effects as the policy actually trickles down to implementation phases.
Yeah, that's where like that again like researchy terms kind of keep coming to my brain is like looking at research and more of like the qualitative end. You really need to look at implicit bias of the person doing the research and acknowledging all of that. And I think that's the piece that the social justice framework really brings in, is looking at who's writing like these laws. Probably a bunch of old white men. Like, you know, who is this really trying to impact? Like, what are we doing all of this for? Like, again, it seems like that takes it a step further versus just like the nuts and bolts of the law, which both are important. Maybe I might tend to be a little bit more biased towards one over the other, but
Yeah.
one was easier to write too, so let's be real about
Yeah,
that.
Yeah, it definitely feels like you don't need a ton of depth of understanding of a policy to write the choice analysis. That can be done basically with like a glance at Wikipedia. Not that that's how I wrote my paper, but coulda. Just saying.
Yeah.
Great.
Shall we move on to question number 2?
Question number 2.
Hello again, Ashley. Thanks for joining us. Jordan, I was wondering, did each policy analysis reveal, or having a normal one, what did each policy analysis reveal regarding the policy's impact to the target population?
Thanks for asking, Sam.
You're welcome.
For the INA, what this makes me think about, like pertaining to our last conversation, is the impacts from the choice policy analysis that I really looked at were more financial for the target populations. So folks that are looking to immigrate into the U.S. Didn't know where to look there, sorry. Folks that are looking to immigrate into the U.S., the financial burden that's placed upon them, the choice policy analysis was really good at looking at the actual finances. So that policy is exclusively funded from the incoming people looking to get green cards to the U.S., whereas the social justice framework really pointed out more of the impacts on the actual populations around family-centered immigration. So the actual ratios and amounts of people that are able to come in is greatly impacted just by the wording of the policy. So that's really what I came up with for the INA. Charlotte, you've been quiet over there. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think I had some similar reflections to you, but with regard to VAWA. And I definitely felt like the choice policy was a more sort of superficial take on what it was intending to do and what the impacts were, how the impacts played out. I felt like the social justice policy really sort of got down into another layer where it actually identified specific populations and how they were impacted by the policy, how the policy was potentially failing them, sort of really highlighting the shortcomings of the policy that the choice policy the choice framework wasn't necessarily capable of capturing.
Yeah, I think I had pretty similar findings in my experience too. I didn't want to write about the exact same subject twice, so I sort of focused on different parts of the Hearth Act. But still, like going back and really trying to imagine what a choice analysis of my social justice topic would be, I still think that the social justice framework took me towards sort of focusing on the people who are disadvantaged, like the clientele of the policy, so chronically homeless people for the most part, who are disadvantaged by the policy. And I think in those, like in the choice analysis, those people are relatively invisible, and you would just see that like, well, this is a performance-based scoring formula grant, and so the lower performers are going to receive less funds. And it's really easy to kind of gloss that as like, we're rewarding high-performing, programs and continuums of care, and not really stop and think about like what that means for programs who either have good contextual reasons to be low-performing, that they're in, an environment where they, for whatever reason, tend to see more exits to whatever, by the scoring metrics perform lower. And the social justice framework really shone a light on that, and I felt like it really shone a light on process and some of the like disturbance and chaos and negative politics that are generated by the implementation of like a really expansive, deep systems change kind of policy. And the choice analysis just like glosses all of that. So again, I don't want to be like talking trash about choice, because I actually think it's a really helpful sort of like basic structure to start from.
Yeah.
But in terms of then like understanding that deeper layer of policy impact, it's pretty inadequate, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely a good jumping off point, but like we talked about in the last question, it's missing a pretty important piece of the picture. And I think the biggest thing that I sort of noticed is that the choice policy might be able to sort of on a surface level tell you who the policy is intended for, but it doesn't.
Right.
It's not able to sort of tease that apart any further, so that you can really see, well, is it doing that, and really sort of highlighting what the shortcomings are. Like I really think that that's where the social justice framework comes in handy, is to sort of take a more critical eye to the policy.
Yeah. I guess I'm partly wondering, like, could I have done a better, more nuanced job with the choice framework? Like, and I honestly can't really picture what that would look like, but I wonder if there is a way, because there is so much overlapping, like, I wonder if there is a way to take a more integrated approach and not have it be either or.
I think giving choice policy analysis like credit where credit is due, like, what we've been saying is important, because it is like the zoom in of the details, which social justice framework really just looks at like the spirit. Like,
Yeah.
are we doing what we set out to achieve in creating this policy?
Yeah.
Whereas choice policy analysis is a good place to start, and then I think even come back to. So if we do choice policy analysis, kind of zoom out to social justice framework and like make sure that this is achieving what we set out to do, and then zoom back in to more detail oriented, like, okay, but what are the actual small parts of this policy that are impacting folks either positively or
Yeah.
negatively, and looking at both sides of that cost benefit analysis really comes back into play. Like, for the INA, like, choice policy analysis was really helpful in looking at quota numbers for incoming folks that are immigrating here, and being able to see just what those differences were and why the policy was written in the way that it was. And then the social justice framework was really helpful to be like, wait, that's fucked up. Like, we shouldn't really have it like that. And then being able to zoom back down and be like, well, this is why they wrote it the way it was, because the lawmakers were a little racist going into it, basically. That was like helpful to like do the zoom in, zoom out, and then zoom back in, and really.
I think that's a good approach in terms of trying to take into account who are the people that maybe aren't present at the table who should be present at the table, and that sort of approach would allow you to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that starting with the choice is pretty helpful, because in some ways the choice analysis is a little more strengths oriented, which sounds kind of weird to say, but like it's easy to be kind of lazily critical with the social justice and just immediately go into like ripping, like any policy is going to fall short, and especially be sort of like vulnerable to kind of glib, negative gloss with, oh, well, the lawmakers were, mostly white men or whatever. Like, yeah, that's true, and that's not necessarily where a policy really starts by the, with the legislator that carries it. And so, I don't know, I think it's helpful to like kind of lay out some of the factual landscape of how things got to be the way they are before you go in with that like really critical lens of the social justice policy analysis.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that, all are perfect, like you said before, like working in tandem, because where the choice policy analysis was really thorough and comprehensive for the ins and outs of the policy, I also really like the piece of, this might be bleeding into the next question, but whatever, I'm going for it. I really like how the social justice framework delved into the process in which laws are created and bills are created, and that piece of like, okay, who was at the table, who wasn't at the table, and like why did it go through those channels that it did or didn't, was really helpful to then go back and be like, oh, that's why they changed like this quota number, or that's why, you know, it disproportionately advantages this population over the population that it's supposed to be targeting to be helpful for. So
They sort of inform each other about your reference point.
In terms of, can you say more about that?
Yeah, so like how Jordan's talking about, like, well, you kind of better understand these elements when you're able to look at these elements. Like, you can see where maybe certain pieces, where a certain component came from, or
Right.
why it changed during a
Right.
revision or something, or reauthorization. It gives you like a little bit more information about what's behind that when you're able to sort of step back and look at, you know, one framework and use that to inform the other position. Yeah, I just think just keeps coming back to the fact that they're better together they're stronger together than they are apart.
Yeah.
So for the third question, we're going to look at what problems does each framework reveal about the policy relative to the following. So the unintended consequences, inadequacies or gaps in responding to the problem that the policy was designed to address. And third, the lack of representation of the target population in the policy development process. So each of us are just going to run through our policies we chose to do for your class and go through those three things. Who wants to start?
I can.
Great, Sam.
So I talked about the Hearth Act and coordinated entry and the federal strategic plan to end homelessness in my analyses. And I think the main thing in terms of adequacy and representation that the Choice Act or the Choice Analysis Framework would reveal is that it's vastly underfunded and cannot be an effective policy implementation for that reason, which is actually really important. And I don't think that the social justice framework would put that quite as front and center. The social justice framework would focus a lot more on sort of authorship and representation and inclusion, which are also really important, I think, like we've been saying. You know, this shouldn't be an either or choice of how you want to look at policy. Let's see, what's the second question there? Inadequacies.
Or gaps.
Right, so I think that's already what I sort of said. I think the unintended consequences that come more to the fore from the social policy or the social justice analysis would be sort of issues of like the on-the-ground politics of rolling out big systems change that the Hearth Act really isn't very specific about how it wants us to achieve like huge systemic change without particularly giving us resources to accomplish that. So yeah, I think you end up with really different sets of information from both. That's where I saw the starkest difference from the analyses. Charlotte, how about you?
Yeah, so like I said, I looked at VAWA, but I specifically honed in on how the policy plays out for immigrants that are living in the U.S. And I found that really the choice policy sort of painted things a little bit better than the social justice framework, just because essentially what you see through some of the reauthorizations is that originally excluded populations are more explicitly accounted for in the reiterations of the policy. So Native populations, LGBT populations, and immigrants are better accounted for just if you're looking at it just from the choice policy framework, because you can see that they're taken into consideration, that their needs are considered, and there's sort of specifics about how that plays out for those individuals logistically. But if you switch gears and look at the social justice policy, then the social justice policy framework, then you can start to see where some of the shortcomings arise. So a lot of the problems have to do with barriers to immigrants who experience domestic violence obtaining safety and utilizing services. And that's problematic in the first place, but especially problematic because there are already discrepancies between the rate of domestic violence among immigrants relative to those who are citizens of the U.S. or who were born in the U.S. So immigrants are already experiencing higher rates. They're more likely to be victimized, and yet they have a harder time obtaining safety and utilizing services because things come up like they need to be able to provide documentation. They need to be able to show a lot of times they have to be sort of willing to testify, which isn't always an option because of safety issues, et cetera, et cetera. So the list really goes on, and I find that that's really sort of a gap that they're missing. They haven't really closed that gap. And there's also a wait period. So, an individual who has children to care for and they're in an unsafe living situation won't be able to get a job and have financial means to move out until a lot of times maybe at least 6 months or so. And so they're having to stay in an unsafe living situation as opposed to being able to get employment immediately through a work visa.
Great. For the INA, super briefly, I kind of want to start out with the social justice oriented, so zoomed out, and looking at the original intention of the policy. And when LBJ signed the Hart-Celler Act into law, creating the INA, the original spirit was really to diversify the United States and to give each person an equal chance to immigrate here regardless of where they came from. However, I think through the social justice framework and looking at the process in which this happened and the Hart-Celler Act became what it was today, the intention then began to shift to more of a nativist attitude and looking at, okay, so if we take this one little clause, like the family-based immigration clause, and make that the emphasis of the INA, which it still is today, then essentially we can keep people of color from immigrating here. Because if you have family connections here that they, without really, I think, doing a lot of research into it, thought it was mostly white in the U.S., so it's mostly Europeans here, so they'll have a easier chance of getting their family members over. That's kind of where that intention went to in changing the Hart-Celler Act's original language, which placed a lot of emphasis on merit-based immigration. So the social justice framework was really helpful in pointing that out. And it still continues to have unintended consequences today, which has resulted in a huge backlog of folks looking to immigrate here based on the family-based program to get a green card to the United States. And so that's where most of our visas are allotted to. And so many people are trying to immigrate in that way instead of merit-based that, again, it's almost a 10-year waiting list often for folks trying to immigrate here and get their family here. So the original spirit of family reunification and equity and equality and being able to immigrate here is totally kind of lost, which if you look at the choice policy analysis, you kind of realize that those quotas were always kind of off from when it was originally legislated. And they only became further skewed when the conservatives kind of messed with those numbers even more, trying to change it to a racist policy. So, there was no representation from the immigrant population either, obviously.
There's a lot of overlap between the INA and VAWA too, mm-hmm. so there's a lot of the same barriers come up, especially in terms of that merit-based consideration that you talk about, because that is a factor for obtaining justice in response to the experience of domestic violence. Mm-hmm. So it's just basically stacks so many cards against people who are already at a disadvantage for obtaining the services that they need and who are already at higher risk for certain vulnerabilities. So it's just kind of something that reinforces a bad system within itself. What overall impression does each framework leave How are those impressions different from one another? Would one framework prompt you to vote for the policy while the other wouldn't? I'll start. So I guess just to keep this really brief, I would say that I think I'm aware that I'm more partial to the social justice framework, just because that's sort of where our hearts lie as social workers. But I think that it is equally as important to take into consideration the more pragmatic factors that the choice framework highlights. So really, again, for me, is sort of being able to look at both positions and make my evaluation from there. But definitely, my own biases lean towards social justice.
Thanks, Charlotte. I think that, like we've said before, both frameworks are really pretty indispensable. I think that the social justice framework leads me towards like a much more sort of person-centric and process-oriented view of how legislation is developed, and then the on-the-ground effects, whereas the choice model leads me towards more of the sort of political process that is likely to be necessary to get something rolled out and adequately resourced. I'm a fan of the Hearth Act as resource-starved and problematic as parts of it are. I think it's a really great piece of legislation that's been really crucial towards or leading us towards sort of bigger system development rather than sort of siloed agency approaches to combating homelessness. So, I have enjoyed applying both frameworks.
I think as a pragmatic lawmaker that the choice policy analysis framework really makes a ton of sense. So if you're looking at how much things cost, whether it's actually feasible to do it, perfect. My hope for lawmakers in the future is that they can kind of, again, continue that thought process and see what vulnerable populations are being impacted and what really the consequences of each policy will be.